Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for attending our documentary screening today on the vertical border and discussion with 4 panelists. I'm just going to very briefly introduce our moderator. Rebecca Galemba is trained as an anthropologist, and she is an associate professor at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She has written The Contraband Corridor, Making a Living at the Mexico-Guatemala Border. And this book highlights the livelihood strategies of residents living along an unmonitored border route in the context of heightened securitization. And just in case anyone was wondering, the Spanish translation has recently been published of this book. Rebecca has also conducted research on abuses committed against migrants in transit at the Mexico-Guatemala border. And her forthcoming book, Unjust Wages, which is under contract with Stanford University Press, is an activist ethnography on immigrant worker justice and the struggle against wage theft in Colorado. Thank you, Rebecca.
Much and welcome to the screening of The Vertical Border, which is directed by Sonja Wolf with photography by Maxime Pluvinet and Cesar Ortiz Lopez with art by Oscar Zermenio Gonzalez. And just to give you a little bit of a structure of the event, first we'll be watching the film. This will be followed by an introduction to some of the panelists, then commentary from the panelists, as well as questions from the audience. So please make sure to tune into and be back for the conversation after you watch the film at 3:15 Eastern Time. Welcome back. I'll reconvene us. Thank you to Sonja Wolf for sharing this powerful film, as well as ISA for hosting it. I am going to briefly give bios of the panelists that are here to comment. We'll have one round of comments from the panelists, and then if you do have questions as the audience, please put those in the Q&A and try to, if you want to address them to particular panelists, please put that there as well. If not, we will pose it to the panelists more generally. And if there's time, we'll open up for more comments as well. I apologize, I have a barking dog. First, I'll introduce Sonja Wolf, who holds a PhD in international politics from Aberystwyth University, or as she told me, University of Wales, is just fine, in the UK, and is an assistant professor with the Drug Policy Program at the Center for Economic Research and Teaching, or CIDE. She held research positions at the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico, ITAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and the Institute for Security and Democracy in CIDE. Her research interests focus on violence, security, and migration, especially in Mexico and Central America. She's also author of the book Mano Dura, The Politics of Gang Control in El Salvador, published by the University of Texas Press in 2017. Next, we have Maxime Pluvinet from Toulon, France. He holds a master's in international relations from Sciences Po in Toulouse. In 2019, he joined Habesha as content creation officer. He was the director of photography for the web documentary El Día de mi Suerte, or My Day Will Come, that was released in Mexico in 2021, which chronicles the life of a young Honduran woman enrolled in the Migrant Protection Protocols, also often known as Remain in Mexico program in Tijuana. Since 2021, he is also a journalist with the Lebanese digital media Ici Beirut. Next is Todd Miller, who you also heard from in the film, who is an author and independent journalist. He resides in Tucson, Arizona, and has researched and written about border issues for more than 15 years. His books include, most recently, and you can see he draws on it in the film, Build Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders, published by City Lights in 2021. And recently before that, Empire of Borders, The Expansion of the US Border Around the World, published by Verso in 2019. 2 years before that, Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, published by City Lights in 2017. and then Border Patrol Nation, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security, also published by City Light in 2014. Todd Miller writes a weekly post for the Border Chronicle, a weekly newsletter that publishes original, on-the-ground reporting, analysis, and commentary about the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Then we have Juan Manuel de la Rosa, who is the legal coordinator of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, or USCRI, in Mexico. He holds a law degree from the Autonomous University of Aguascalientes and a specialization in international migration from the Colegio de la Frontera Norte, or el COLEF. He's worked as a legal advisor on legislative and regulatory matters at the Secretary of the Interior in Mexico, or SIGO, as well as the State Human Rights Commission and the Public Defenders Institute in the Mexican state of Aguascalientes. He has researched immigration issues, including the recognition of university degree certificates for refugees in Mexico. And I do want to apologize for my barking dog, who was silent during the entire film. And now I will turn it over to the panelists.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Well, so we're having this first round of comments. Really, what we're hoping to do in this event is to have a conversation with the audience. So first of all, thank you to everyone who connected, who wanted to see the film and discuss the film with us. And also thank you to my fellow panelists, Maxime, who is really the main person in Habesha, who has worked on the documentary to make this possible. And also thank you to Todd and Juan Manuel for participating in the film. So I thought initially I wanted to speak briefly about why we wanted to do this documentary, and later on, if there's time, perhaps we could speak a little bit more about what we can do with this documentary now that it's being released. So forced migration, this is something that we've looked into before at the CIDE. So before even doing this documentary, we studied forced migration and produced some materials on the subject already, but we wanted to take this a little further. Essentially bring this to a larger audience and also in a different format. But perhaps the two main points that we wanted to emphasize in the film are, on the one hand, forced migration itself, and the other point is the vertical border. Yeah, so perhaps we have two perhaps quite complex ideas. Yeah. So first of all, when we talk about migration is itself quite a broad concept. And so when we look at why people are leaving their communities and their countries, there are different labels that over time have been applied to people. So we might describe people as internally displaced persons. We also have refugees and asylum seekers, and even UNHCR has tried to broaden these categories a little in order to be able to respond to the needs of a larger population. But I think there's still this tendency to distinguish between migrants who seem to be leaving their countries voluntarily and other people who are forcibly displaced, whether it's within the borders of the country or across international borders. And so when we emphasize that this is not a film just about migration, but about forced migration, we wanted to go a little bit deeper into why it is that people are leaving their countries, because a lot of the time we are seeing migrants in the news, but we don't hear perhaps enough about why they're leaving and why they should be considered forced migrants. So forced migration is really a global issue, but as you will have seen, the documentary focuses especially on people leaving Central America who are headed towards Mexico and the United States. So why should we be talking about Central Americans in terms of forced migrants? You will have seen at the beginning of the documentary that the situation in Central America continues to be difficult, and this helps explain why people feel compelled to leave their countries. But when we look at countries such as El Salvador and Honduras, perhaps it is the physical violence that comes to mind, especially gang violence, also organized crime. But this doesn't explain really everything that people have to go through in Central America. So of course, people's experiences are quite different, but we can see that there are overlaps in people's experiences. So of course, we can say that the physical violence that people are experiencing in their communities is one important reason why people feel they need to go to Mexico perhaps, or to the United States. But another important reason is what we might call structural violence. And this is perhaps a little harder to sell, because one might think that people are going to Mexico, or especially the United States, because they're looking for better economic opportunities, or perhaps because they're chasing the so-called American dream. But if we think of these migrants as voluntary migrants or just economic migrants, I think this does not really capture the gravity of the situation in Central America. So by emphasizing that this is forced migration, we really wanted to emphasize how serious or how difficult the conditions are for many people in Central America, and that these conditions really make people think that that there is no alternative to migration. And so this is, as I said, one point we wanted to emphasize in the documentary, show why it's important to emphasize the context and the constraints that people are experiencing in their lives. And the other part has to do with what we call the vertical border in the film. So again, perhaps you might say that the situation of violence and the crisis of human rights in Mexico is not new as such. Even the abuses that migrants are experiencing have been documented before. But when we talk about the vertical border, we wanted to draw attention to more than migration controls. You will see in the documentary that there are different actors. The non-state actors are more hidden, but we certainly see state actors. For example, the National Migration Institute. We also hear about Mexico's refugee agency, and of course, there are also soldiers, and especially the National Guard that was created by the current president, and that is also now playing a role in migration controls. So again, when we talk about migration, perhaps instinctively we think more about this formal migration control apparatus, especially the Migration Institute. But I think we have to broaden our look at Mexico a little, and to see that really the obstacles that migrants are facing relate not only to the migration controls or migration practices that Mexico is implementing, but also to the effects of the so-called drug war that was first launched in 2006. And so we have seen over time that really the situation for migrants has become much more difficult, in part because of the violence that is playing out, not just between criminal groups, but also between criminal groups and the state itself. And so this violence that is associated with this war has affected not only Mexican citizens, but also migrants. But of course, for migrants who are in the country without authorization, or even for their families who are still in Central America, it is very difficult to obtain redress or some sort of justice for the abuses that have been committed against migrants. So I think I leave it here, just perhaps for further reflection, also for the discussion. you might think that the focus in the documentary is on Mexico, but really what we see is all of this connecting, not just in terms of issues, but also that the countries, Central America, Mexico, and the United States are linked really through this vertical border. Yeah, so we might think that perhaps the root of all this is in Central America, where people are leaving. But I think we also need to recognize that this vertical border is operating because of what the United States is trying to do in the region. So this deterrence strategy really operates through this vertical border that we have looked at in Mexico. Thank you.
Maxime?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to ISA to let us a space. Really, I will not add that much. I'm waiting for the question, maybe on more about the process of making the documentary, just highlighting the fact, like we're taking Sonja's word on that it's not only about migration, and highlighting the fact that maybe you saw in the documentary that there were not many migrants or refugees interviewed. That's a reason. No, we wanted to focus on the process, the complex process of what we call the vertical border, which is much more than the wall, for example, which is the most maybe visible part of how the United States is deterring migration. But we begin the documentary, that's why we begin in Central America, much more at the south, because maybe just highlighting one event when we were shooting the documentary, reaching Arizona. At that time, there were a real focus from the US media, for example, on the US southern border because of the 10,000, 15,000 Haitians blocked in Del Rio, between Ciudad Acuña and Del Rio. And really, it was. I remember I was actually in Phoenix, waiting for my bus to see Todd in Tucson, and I saw how the U.S. media were focusing on the national security issue of the southern border, but at any moment they were mentioning, for example, the dramatic situation from Chiapas, which was occurring 1 month earlier from that event, and it showed us while we were shooting the documentary how maybe the US audience sometimes is not aware of the root causes of that migration, and if they are not aware of these root causes, much less they will be aware of how the whole strategy is to block, to deter this migration at the southern border. Like obviously, as Fray Gabriel says it in Tenosique, the wall and the northern border of Mexico and Tijuana and all this place, of course, there is repression and there is deterrence strategy, but the deterrence is much more at the south now, through, of course, migration controls, the Mexican migration apparatus, but also things such as advertisement, as you may see, for example, in the San Pedro Sula scene in Honduras, you may see in San Pedro Sula this advertisement from the IOM saying that at any time they could pay their flight back before even their departure, forced departure from Honduras. So the vertical border, it's all these elements from soft power to hard power that we wanted to highlight, and I will stay here to maybe discuss on the making of the documentary, or even to discuss much more about the solutions which Todd actually presented in the long discussion we had when we made the interview. And of course, because of the selection, it's only a part of the reflection showed at the end of the documentary, but I really hope we could discuss that here. Thank you.
Okay, I'll turn over to Todd Miller next.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for this. Thanks, Rebecca and Sonja and Maxime. It was really an honor to be able to participate and be a part of this film. And I have to say, I thought it was sweeping. Like as Maxime just mentioned, so often in the United States, our awareness of the border, right, it ends at the border, right? It doesn't go any further. And so the vertical border part of it and how it starts, where it starts with Oscar Martinez in El Salvador, I thought it was really incredible. And those I should mention too before I continue the also the cinematography I thought was beautiful, and the music was really moving, and it really, I thought, wove from one place to the other really well. And that the idea, like looking at the two major themes of the movie, the forced migration part of it, like starting with Oscar Martinez and in El Salvador, and getting that historic context was just so. It was to the violence in El Salvador, for example. It's just so it gives that rich context that so often is lacking in many like media accounts of what's going on in Central America, and how it's portrayed to the public in the United States. So I'm looking from the U.S. public point of view. And so having those historic, linkages and giving that context and understanding and unpacking the violence and understanding the historical nature and the civil war in El Salvador, and, the different things all the way to the Matanza, sorry, from 1932 in El Salvador. Just understanding the whole history of it, I think, was just invaluable. And also, other parts of the forced migration, like going into Honduras and understanding, the neoliberal economic model, and how, like as Sonja mentioned, how so many things, there's so many things playing into each other, like so many different factors that are interrelate. And Berta Cáceres and the extractivism, and seeing like the kind of resistance that's happening. So I really appreciated, that sort of overview and the historic context that was given on one side to looking at the idea of forced migration. And then on the other hand, the vertical border, like I thought, there's a lot of things that I learned really from this movie. And excuse my voice, I've been suffering a cold, so I have my voice has been a little bit iffy for the last couple of days. But like giving the extra context of the drug war, for example, and how it plays out in Mexico, to the vertical border, I thought it was just really excellent analysis. And I immediately thought of the Merida initiative, right? The multi-billion-dollar U.S. Military assistance plan that was from 2008, which was under the context of the drug war. And then, of course, in its evolutions, I think it has a new name now. I think it's been renamed something else. But the third pillar became, creating a 21st century border in Mexico. So, the idea of those two things coming together, I thought was really, really poignant analysis, and very informative, and actually critical to understanding what the border is, how, like, and again, from a U.S. perspective, how we're often thought that the border is one thing, the U.S.-Mexico border, but it's really much bigger, much more expansive, going many places, vertical, like exactly how you put it. So those are my first impressions. This is my first time watching it right now, so these are just kind of my immediate impressions. But I thought it was great. And I just want to stress the cinematography. I thought was just really sweeping. So thank you.
And then we'll go to Juan Manuel de la Rosa.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just would like to say that, well, it's an honor to be part of this panel. And also it was really amazing to be part of this documentary. As Todd said, I think it's amazing. The cinematography, it's beautiful. I think it really highlights what really happens. You know, I have been here in the border. This office of UCRI in Mexico has been open for over a year, and I think everything that you saw on the documentary, at least going until Tijuana or the Mexican border with the US, you can witness it as the people tells you all the stories, you know, how they come from Honduras, El Salvador, how they were victims of violence by the Mexican authorities, and also how the United States are not they're building walls that are not just physical, but also they are not letting anyone having some sort of options of legal options to cross and ask for any kind of help. No, so to me it was really interesting, and I think it really highlights this vertical border, as they said. No, I would like to maybe share something that I wrote, and well, just I will be reading it really shortly. So well, as you know, well, UNHCR, last year they said there were like around 84 million people displaced in the world, and these people were moving because of crisis, because of wars, because of internal conflicts, because of climate change. So the idea of, as Sonja said, the idea of migrants, of economic and displaced people have been really moving, and it's really important to acknowledge the profile of these people, because they have different needs, you know, and you cannot say it as they were the same as how maybe they were treated before. It's necessary to start changing the narrative around these people. And as long as I've been here, it has been quite interesting, and also it's been for the people that has been here and that comes to my office to understand that right now, for example, as long as since the implementation of MPP in 2019 until 2021, when it went finished, and then it was reinstated in late 2021, and how there is basically no information on where, for example, who is it's super discretional how people can roll into these programs, but also adding to that the Title 42, who for pandemic issues, people could not enter even in a maybe undocumented way and then ask for asylum there. They couldn't even have that possible outlet or inlet to ask for asylum. So they were without any kind of help with any kind of legal help, which kind of lead to fraud, misinformation for people here, trafficking also. There were a lot of people who were stranded, and they asked for any kind of help. It doesn't matter where it came from. And we here in our office, we hear lots of cases of that sort. We even had some beneficiaries who were victims of maybe not in a really harsh way, but they were from extortion as well, because they were asking for any kind of aid or support and they didn't have it. And also Mexican, as you saw, we have been witness of how Mexican authorities, migration, and also army have been really just, instead of asking and wondering what are the needs with these people, they're not being kind of they are not kind of understanding the needs of these people, and also trying to understand that, for example, last year in Mexico was the biggest year with requests for asylum seekers in Mexico. Well, refugee protection, it was around 131,000 people. So there's actually no there hasn't been a lot of changes to attend all of these requests. So that makes another like struggle for these people. And maybe what's really interesting from my parts, and is that this is actually really funny, because funny in a way that I was talking about this exact same topic with a fellow NGO, and we were asking what does it mean to be a migrant, or nowadays, at least here in Tijuana, who is trying to move forward, but you cannot go backwards. But also Mexican authorities, it's not looking into what you can do, or they're not trying to provide you any kind of help. So it must be really stressful, and it must be really, and there's a lot of cases of people who have anxiety, depression. There are a lot of families that are here together and that have diseases and cannot be treated. And also, I mean, I think there hasn't been a politic about doing visible all of this community. And it's amazing that there's a docu-series like this, or the documentary, that provides this information, and also explain and expresses what they go through, so that, you know, we can start a dialogue about where should we start, or how should we direct our dialogue for these people, or the needs or the issues, or how should we take on to all of these problems, no? So yeah, well, after that long speech, I would like to say thanks for inviting me for this panel.
Thank you. If you can please put some questions into the Q&A for our panelists. Maybe I'll give a couple of minutes to round up a first round of questions. And if not, I also have a few questions I'd love to ask the panelists as well.
I actually have a question, if that's okay. So I am wondering basically about the people that you interviewed and whether that posed any risks to them, especially if they were in Mexico or working for certain organizations, and what steps that you took to try and alleviate that situation.
To speak about the two people, the two migrants interviewed in the documentary. Yes. Well, at that time when we were in Tapachula, which was the city where we interviewed Isaias and Evelyn, as I call them in the documentary, actually they were it was quite interesting to have their point of view, because both of them had already tried to migrate through Mexico in the past years, no? In particular, Evelyn, her first trip, she told me it was in 2009 when she was still a child, and so she already knew the beast. She could see the evolution of the track. So their point of view were invaluable, and for protection in this case, they were both asking asylum in Mexico at the time where we made the interview. We convened that we would not directly shoot their faces, although obviously just with the mask we could recognize them. It was a question we asked ourselves about the confidentiality and anonymity, and often it's actually an interesting debate, which I think should happen at every moment, at every work now, about should we show the faces. Obviously, a journalist would say, I want faces, I need faces, and a humanitarian would say, I would first make protection. And after speaking really in depthly with both of them, no, with Evelyn and Isaias, we came to the conclusion both that they were not directly in need of protection. I mean, they were in need of protection in Mexico, but they were not persecuted in Mexico. So they were not afraid of both sharing their faces and their stories. Just to comment that afterwards, to show how the decisions can change because of the despair of waiting, no, in Mexico. 2 months after the interview, they decided to cross the state of Chiapas, which, as mentioned in the documentary, it's considered as an abandon to their request. And here also we show another effect of the vertical border. No, that how the despair, the fact of waiting, of despair, is really pretty much part of the strategy. Also, has the deterrence and through prevention through deterrence strategy had it about the fact that circumvents the places and go to much more dangerous places. The vertical border also has this effect about hoping that because of the waiting, the long months of waiting, people would despair. But people don't despair. I mean, they got desperate, but they cannot go back home, and that's why this whole system doesn't understand and highlight that they are fleeing from their countries because of forced and structural violence. So it's not like an option to come back. Even when we see the numbers, for example, of voluntary return, no? Which is a program of IOM to finance some migrants who would be desperate and wanted to go back voluntarily. There are very few numbers. And I'm not sure about the fact that all these experience of voluntary return are successful. But so yeah, to come back to your question, like we discussed with them directly, and because of the situation at that time, because they were asking asylum in Mexico, they didn't feel persecuted. They agreed to share their testimonies. But as I said, between the time of shooting the interview and editing the documentary, many things happens. No? Maybe it would be the occasion in another question to mention that many facts in the documentary changed while we edited it, no? Such as, for example, ex-Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, which is maybe a good highlight, not to show how the institutions are not maybe working in these countries, and that they cannot wait help from the institutions if the president itself was put on drug charges, no, by the US Treasury.
I'd love to ask a question that sort of brings together the three themes that I think were raised by the film, as well as I think that Sonja laid out so nicely for us, this idea of the vertical border, the terminology of forced displacement and the rhetoric, as well as the previous question about kind of how the film will be disseminated and how even the strategy of filming a film that could cross borders as seamlessly as was done in the film can sort of then build this kind of solidarity or audiences to kind of push back on this. And, you know, I saw a few things with the verticality, and I'm interested a little bit about the term vertical border. And again, this kind of expanding what we see at the border is not just fencing, as, you know, Todd mentioned the virtual technologies, or Juan mentioned these kind of bureaucratic borders, euphemistic borders that are put up, such as protection protocols. And I guess I had a question more related to, you know, to way this terminology can get us to ways that the border has not only been exported outward to the United States, but become more diffuse, sometimes menace inward, including within the United States itself, even after migrants arrive, as well as historically. And I was also curious how you incorporate the historical structural roots of these issues that you mentioned in the film to this idea of vertical bordering. And I think, you know, Todd brings up this concept of border imperialism, right? And so do we date the vertical border back to the very kind of open borders that the United Fruit Company or the CIA or the US State Department has experienced in its own actions abroad as part of that concept of the vertical border? I think would be interesting to think with a little bit more. Similarly, these kind of euphemisms I thought were really interesting. The terminology we use, the idea of a crisis. I know Todd brings that up in the film, and I know this is a question that I've seen a lot on circulating on Twitter, in other conferences, and like this whole rhetoric of forced displacement, right? And how we really question what we're using to talk about the reasons people are fleeing, recognizing that these terms are often used to disqualify deservingness for the majority of people. And the question we often see now is how Ukrainian refugees, for example, are being welcomed in contrast to Syrians, to Afghans, to Central Americans. I saw scholar Lamis Abdelhadi talk about this idea that when we talk about crisis now and refugee crisis with Ukraine, we rightly locate that crisis to Ukraine, versus when we talk about the European refugee crisis or the Central American refugee crisis, it locates that as a crisis for Europe, for the United States. And kind of how do we think about these euphemisms and the work that they're doing? And that extends to, again, you know, what are the plans to disseminate this film in Central America, in Mexico, and in the United States? And how could this film be part of a way of pushing back or resisting these dynamics of the vertical border?
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, you've raised many points, and perhaps I will take up two, and then perhaps my fellow panelists would like to add something. So perhaps if I if I start with the beginning of the documentary, you mentioned the historical context, and I think bringing in this context was important because it allows us to show that in all this crisis narrative, there's this idea that something new is happening, something unprecedented, something unexpected, and we need to respond to it now. And this is what leads us to the wrong approaches. Yeah. So when there's suddenly a humanitarian crisis or a border crisis, it brings in a lot of the time emergency responses, not more considered policy strategies, really. And also, when we talk about the historical context in the film, it also allows us to show perhaps a little bit more the role of the United States. So the United States is not a country that as Trump said, is being invaded by large numbers of migrants, that is simply at the receiving end of this crisis. But it's a country that for a long time has played a role in the instability that the Central American countries have been experiencing. So by bringing out this historical context, I hope we can show that the two ends are really connecting, yeah, so that it is really hypocritical in a sense on the part of the United States to not to acknowledge the role it has played in Central America, and then when people are being displaced and they're looking for assistance and international protection, richer countries such as the United States close their doors to these people. Yeah, so this is why I think the historical context was important. In terms of concepts, I think it is easy for anyone to feel overwhelmed when we look at policy discussions, also at the academic literature that is out there. I mean, there's an abundance of concepts, and of course, people are trying to understand better what is happening, but this has led really to a proliferation of concepts, how to think, as you said, how to think about the border or borders, what is happening, where is the border spreading, is it something horizontal or something vertical, is it reaching into Central America or perhaps also into the interior of the United States? And on the other hand, we have many concepts that try to describe who the migrants are, yeah, what their intentions are, what kind of responses should be required to their situation. And perhaps if I can link this to another point you briefly raised, dissemination, what to do with this documentary. I think especially when we look at the concepts, I thought it was important to keep this simple, yeah, because this is not, even though it's based on academic research, inspired by it, we wanted to create something that is really accessible for anyone and that can encourage broader discussion. So if we bring in too many concepts, if we make this very technical, people may not perhaps be very receptive to our message. So I thought it was important to keep this simple, not to bring in too many concepts. I mean, it would be a very long film if we wanted to discuss all the concepts that are out there. So this is really our proposal. Really to contribute to the conversations that are already out there, but hopefully to bring in some more clarity, and also to encourage people to watch the documentary and discuss it. Yeah, and perhaps we can come back to this later on. But I think this hopefully will be one of the main conclusions for people, that really it is up to all of us. Yeah, if we want to see a social change or more adequate responses to forced migration or migration generally, then we all need to join this conversation and really see this as a first step. And I think there is Sarah's question that is in the chat about advice for policymakers. So I will just briefly reiterate what I just said. In terms of, I think with the documentary is the question of packaging the story in a different way. We did not want to treat it like an academic document where we make some policy recommendations, because for me, really, what how all this started, why I was interested in a documentary film is really this dilemma that I think we often face in academia. There is lots of research evidence. There are also policy recommendations, but a lot of the time, studies and policy recommendations do not get taken into account. So what I see as the problem is not the lack of research evidence or perhaps disinterest on the part of researchers to engage with policymakers, not at all. But I think policymaking is very often shaped by politics, and politics prevents policymakers from pondering perhaps more the strategies they should be implementing. So in terms of specific advice for policymakers, I think I would not even want to get near this idea of advice for policymakers insofar as the documentary is concerned. I would like to consider it a tool for education and for discussion that I would like many people to take advantage of. So rather than making specific policy recommendations with this documentary, what I really would like to do is to encourage people to watch the documentary, to share it, and to discuss it. And I think this really should be the starting point for perhaps for more specific organizing in terms of advocacy, but also for policy recommendations that can be implemented. Thank you.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on either of the questions posed? We don't have any questions in the chat right now.
If I may just, I'm sorry, Juan, just mentioning something more about what said Sonja and the solutions, saying that about, you mentioned the Ukrainian or the European context, no, in a moment. This documentary could have been made in Europe, in Hungary, in Libya, in Turkey, in other parts of the world where the problem, the issue is the same. No, we saw it with David Scott Fitzgerald reminding that it's a global issue, a global strategy from the northern countries, the global north, blocking this migration. And about introducing the subject of solutions. Of course, we cannot think about individual solutions. As citizens, of course, we may have an opinion about the subject. And of course, this kind of documentaries are here to create an opinion and a call to action. However, it cannot be individual, because I think about one of Todd's book, Build Bridges, Not Walls, which treat at the very beginning about this subject. If you're an individual as a US citizen or European citizen, for example, in the case of the US, you see a migrant dying of thirst in the desert, and you try to pick him up to bring him to the nearest city, it's a federal, you can be charged with a federal crime. No? In France, if you help a migrant dying in the mountains of the Alps or in Calais, you may be charged also, maybe not with jail, but with money. No? So it's called crime of solidarity in France. No, it's we reached that's kind of oxymoron. No, crime of solidarity. So of course it cannot be individual solutions. We might think about institutional solutions, no, which not necessarily include policymakers, because, for example, I work in a Mexican NGO from the civil society, which is Habesha, shown in the documentary, which, to be honest and to be critical, do not make only auto promotion. Of course, it's included in the broader political goals of the US to finance the asylum system and the civil society initiatives in Mexico, so they don't reach the US. Now it can be seen this way. We can be honest about that, but we are trying to react about the situations. Also, Juan Manuel, it can be a better witness of that from the northern Mexican border. Every day is adapting to the few legal possibilities that the US can let to the migrants. No, there is MPP, there is Title 42, but there is this tiny little line that can help maybe to 10 migrants out of 100 to cross the border. No, so I would like to say we could see, like, individually, no, the solution, like it could be an individual call to action through donation, working in NGO, making awareness, but it's not only it's not possible as an individual solution, because actually the vertical border itself includes the repression of the individual solutions we could make helping a migrant or refugee, if we know one. No, so that was something I wanted to highlight from the marvelous and amazing lecture I made from Todd's book, Build Bridges, Not Walls, which could be also a point to the linked to the documentary to find solutions. No?
We'll go to Juan Manuel. Thank you.
Yeah, from my part, I think first of all, I mean, obviously I don't work at politics, so I could not give like a proper answer to like how could we. But from my point of view, from what I have been facing here at the border, I think it will be really important, one, to acknowledge the needs of these people. You know, it's like they're mobilizing, and I think it's important about when you talk about like displacement to talk about not mobilizing just as a not just as men or women who are like on a productive age, or maybe they're like older people or children. So you cannot so children are in a different, I mean, the groups change, the profile change, so you have to be more on the needs of these people, which it will be more important to tend to. And the second of all, I think it would be really good if you could have more transparent or more legal pathways for people to access to everything. You know, I think here, even with Mexico and of course in the US with the border closed, I think it has been a really like harsh topic to just like to find out solutions or legal solutions for people any from here or there, because sometimes they do have answer. Well, sometimes there's a pathway, but sometimes maybe there's not like capacity of the institution to attend to these needs, or maybe there is but they don't want to attend to it, or maybe there's no existing information regarding any programs. For example, MPP, for this re-implementation, what we have been facing is there's not a solid information regarding on how it's working, only the reports DHS is providing to the people, or maybe like the reports or the monitoring people elsewhere are doing, but there's nothing more. And people asking for more help or for more info, there's not. So there's a lot of discretion when you talk about migration, at least in Mexico and the US, and both of them have given us a lot of, I mean, me and well, this organization, as all of the other organizations that I know here in Tijuana, have provided a lot of challenges, I guess, to just try to find out a solution for the problems they're presenting or the needs they require. There is no pathways to provide lots of things. I understand people control their inflows and outflows, but I think there should be more like structured and more visual pathways for people to know what to do, ask for if they are candidates, or if they can do any or that, so they could plan their migration project, you know.
I think you both bring out really interesting tensions that we see towards, especially the end of the documentary, between these really desires to revise unjust systems and, create something and envision something new, as Todd talks about, with recognizing the very real realities of helping people in the predicaments that they're in, and ways to provide perhaps some solutions in the meantime within those. I want to just take the last few minutes to ask Todd or Sonja if they had anything that they would like to close with. And thank you again.
Perhaps Todd, if you want to go first.
Sure. Just briefly. I think we're hearing all kinds of great things and ideas from everyone, so I really appreciate that. One thing I always think about when and Rebecca, I think you mentioned this in your commentary earlier, when like if you say open borders or something like that, the immediate thought is, the border apparatus and people coming to the border, people often from forced migrations coming to the border, arriving to the U.S. border, and very rarely is the idea that there's already an open border system in place, that there's a whole set of people and so a whole set of power dynamics and circumstances and capital that can go over the border without any sort of restrictions at all. There's no impediment to it, and I think those issues are highlighted very clearly in the vertical border, right? From the even deportation crosses borders without being stopped. So like in El Salvador, when gang members from Southern California were deported, or the kind of like they mentioned Hurricane Mitch, the idea of these sorts of events. And you could even look at the back-to-back hurricanes that happened in Central America a year or so ago, which caused incredible amounts of displacement. And then when I think it was like 8,000 Hondurans crossed the border from Honduras into Guatemala, they were met by a blockade of U.S. trained police and military who blockaded a road in Guatemala. So the vertical border, right? You have these elements of the vertical border and these kind of elements of forced displacement. But the sort of thing of open borders, of what can cross borders, like the extractivism, like companies can fly over borders at 35,000 feet and do whatever it is, the way that certain agreements have been made. So if you're a company, you can go wherever you want and do whatever you want, take whatever you want, and pollute whatever you want, for example. And so I think there's a tension there. I don't know. I'm not like pointing to a solution, but I think there's a tension there that points to, from the United States point of view, the whole border issues and immigration issues are often thought of as domestic. They're put in a domestic context, and that's like wrong, right? In this documentary, this film, I think a huge part of the solution is in what it would be international, like viewing it from an international perspective, and then the natural inclination that I see is a sort of cross-border international solidarity that got, bringing together of people across borders to be discussing, talking like we're doing right now, talking about issues. And then I think the great thing, it seems like there will be many organic conversations that could come from this.
I'll let Sonja close us out.
Okay, thank you.
There's one question. Sorry, perhaps you want to answer, because I think it's a great question for you. Is how can an individual or a university purchase access to the documentary? And then if there's anything you'd like to close us out with.
Sure. Okay. So I'll include this in my final comments. Perhaps I'd like to end with two thoughts, and they revolve around how to bring this to policymakers, but also ultimately what to do with this documentary. I think perhaps a lot of the time when we think about policy recommendations, we get into specific details, and of course we need to think about particular measures such as the MPP program that was mentioned in the documentary, and how to provide really solutions, if there are solutions, or at least responses to different parts of the migrant population. As Juan Manuel said, people have they come from different experiences, and they have different needs. But I think, at least for the purposes of the documentary, I would like us to move a little bit away from a specific policy measures, and think about the idea that when we think about the root causes of forced migration, we're really talking about a series of complex problems, and that are interrelated, and that perhaps might make us think that the situation is very difficult to tackle, and perhaps this in turn leads many people to focus on specific policy measures, because thinking in terms of structural issues and how we might respond to them just seems too overwhelming. But I would like to emphasize that actually these structural transformations is what is needed if we really want to provide a more tangible, a more comprehensive response to forced migration. So if we avoid talking about the structural transformations that are needed, we're never going to get there. We're just going to stay at the surface. So related to that, I think one of my main points really is that I would like people to engage with this documentary. Of course, we would like it to be watched by many individuals, including policymakers, also members of Congress, especially in the United States. It seems to me it would be very important for people there to watch the documentary and see how they can exert pressure on the US government, but also on members of Congress. So in terms of what to do with this documentary, I think fundamentally what this is about, as Maxime said, it can serve as a call to action, but first of all, perhaps a call for reflection and debate. So hopefully people will feel that the documentary offers them a different way of viewing forced migration, of finding out a little bit more about who the individuals are who are leaving Central American countries in this case, and hopefully in this more indirect way, when people perhaps feel better informed about forced migration, we can have also more informed debates, and ultimately greater pressure on policymakers to implement different strategies. And so, just briefly to respond to the last question in the chat, since we would like this documentary to be an educational tool, there's no cost associated with the documentary. It does not need to be purchased, and there's no cost for screening. So throughout March, we will have a number of virtual screenings and Q&As, such as this one, because we would like to engage with the audiences. From April onwards, really, the documentary will be available publicly. We're creating a platform where the documentary will be hosted indefinitely. So anyone who would like to see it, and we're perhaps especially encouraging anyone who studies or who works at the university, also in schools, members of film clubs, to organize their own screenings and to sit down and discuss the documentary. So there's no cost associated with this.
thank you all for your time today and for your thoughtful responses to the questions. And we hope that this is the start of many future great viewings. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing the film.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.